with highs of 12 or 13 Celsius towards the north, up to 15 or 16 degrees in the southeast.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Andrew Pearce. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking,
this is the nightmare for the Conservatives again.
down to earth,
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
and most importantly, honest,
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Offline and overlooked. That's what Age UK say millions of British pensioners are. Why? Because they cannot or won't access the internet. It's leading to digital exclusion. So the charity's campaigning for public services like banks, utilities and even the NHS to maintain a more human approach.
Everything's online. People assume you've got a smartphone with a mobile number and an email, and without that you don't exist in this world anymore. We've got to try and get the government to see that it's so important to make people feel that they belong, because there's a feeling that the older generation just feel that they're forgotten, they're in the way, and we already know that anyway, but it's just another reason for them to feel that they're not wanted. They'll just accept it and they'll say, well, that's it, I can't do it anymore. And that's it, whereas other people would be really kicking and screaming. So we need to be the voice for older people.
Despite digital technology playing an increasing role in our lives, around 1 in 5 over 65s in the UK don't use the internet. Thornycroft Centre in Pontefract, West Yorkshire provides a space for this age group to socialise and get help to go online.
I'm not that good with mobiles, so when you mention anything about online, I ain't a clue what you're talking about.
The closure of thousands of banks is also detrimental to the older generation.
A lot of our members what come, they tend to use cash. They don't like to use bank cards. I think a lot of it's trust or the lack of knowledge. They don't understand how it works. I think they're very vulnerable as well with online. It's really important that they're aware how to use it and how to use it safely.
So, in an online era, it's still crucial for many to have an offline option.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Gloria De Piero. This is GB News, Britain's election channel.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Another week brings another set of headaches for the government. I'll be asking the Minister for Policing, Chris Philp, does he actually know the difference between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo? I'll be asking Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting whether his colleague Deputy Leader Angela Rayner is a tax avoider. Former Energy Minister Graham Stewart will be joining me in the studio following his recent resignation from government. Can we really reach net zero by 2050 and at what cost to the taxpayer? I'll also be speaking to Sir David Davis as he plans to abseil down Anfield for a charity this afternoon. Former Defence Secretary Dr Liam Fox will be here to share his latest book, The Coming Storm, which looks at why water will prompt the biggest crisis of the 21st century. And former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick will be delving into details of his new report on legal migration. Do we need to cap the number of people coming into Britain? It's going to be a jam-packed 90 minutes of pure politics this morning, so you won't want to go anywhere. It's wet, it's windy. Get a cup of tea and settle in for the next 90 minutes because we're going to be cramming in a great deal, and it's going to start, of course, by going through the morning papers. I'm delighted to be joined now by Nicholas Owen, former BBC broadcaster and journalist. Nicholas, lovely to see you this morning. Loving that tie.
Thank you.
Bright and fun for a Sunday morning. Right, the biggest story of the day, I think you'll agree, is the defection of Dan Poulter, the Tory, to Labour. This is all over the Observer. To be fair, a good scoop for them.
Absolutely, and he writes a big column in it to explain why he's done it.
Why is he doing it?
Well, he says that as a Conservative, he can't look his patients in the eye anymore. He seems to spend most of his time being in NHS. I think he's a psychiatrist and works in the mental health side.
Yes.
Jolly good, all of that. Not much time as a politician recently, frankly. But he says the Tories have let the country down, etc., concentrating on bearing down on pay increases when they should be doing other things. But my question is quite simply, Dan, OK, fine. What's Labour that you're going to rushing towards are going to do any different? Mind you, he says he's not going to stand for Labour
at the election. Well, this is quite interesting. He's defecting now. I mean, obviously, that's a blow to Rishi Sunak after what's been quite a good week for the Prime Minister. He's got Rwanda bill through the Commons. He's got defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP. I think it's been a fairly good week, considering some other weeks haven't been that good. Now this, but yet Poulter doesn't have confidence in Labour enough to actually stand for them at the next general election and indeed be a Labour MP or minister.
No, but he says he's going to advise them. I don't know whether that's an actual... And the pictures this morning, we're actually signing up to the Labour, to become a Labour member and so on. But as I say, my question is, fine, OK, jolly good. And I think you're talking to Wes Streeting.
Yes, I am. He's going to be...
You've got to nail this down. You know, what's the difference going to be? We can all see these enormous waiting lists. We've all witnessed it. I've seen it in my local hospital, all sorts of problems. But, you know, come on, what are the actual concrete alternatives?
Yes,
something we must keep asking Labour.
I'll be asking Wes Streeting that a little later in the show. To be fair, though, this is a coup for Keir Starmer. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it does look good. It's in the front of the Observer. It's all over the TV and newspapers. I mean, and it's a bad reflection on 14 years of Tory rule. You know, this lack of confidence in how the Tories have been running the NHS. But as you say, Nick, let's see if the Labour Party can do any better. Let's move up north, go to Scotland.
Yes.
I'm calling this section kilt-clad chaos. This is extraordinary. I mean, I think it was a bit cruel to call Humza Useless when he was first elected. That was his kind of nickname. However, my goodness me.
Well, he's doing politics in a slightly different way, isn't he? Writing to his opponents to say, please help me, please support me here. I think the answer to that is very prompt, isn't it?
Let's give some context to this. So, obviously, in the week, he decides to ditch the Greens. That was a coalition pact that was set up by his predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, who's got her own problems right now. Let's keep her out of it for the moment. He's now facing a no-confidence vote, sensibly tabled by the Labour leader in Scotland, Sawa, and it looks as if he'll probably lose it. Therefore, he's sending begging letters to others to try and shore up his leadership. Let's be honest, he's only been in office just a little over a year. Most of his time in office has been pretty disastrous. And the person that has the deciding vote, Nick, is Ash Regan, who's the Alba MP, who he famously said when she defected from his party to Alba that it was no great loss to the SNP. She defected, of course, because she didn't agree with his support of this gender self-identification lunacy up in Scotland, enabling men to claim that they're women and then go into prisons and all the rest of it. I mean, do you think that the SNP is going to have a disastrous general election after all this?
I think so. There's all the indications of that, isn't it? It looks as though Labour, that's another place that Labour are going to be targeting in a major way, of course.
Actually, they could win the election in Scotland
I think so,
in a way, couldn't they? If they get their numbers back up. That
quite possible. Fascinating, too, in the background, Alex Salmond of Alba.
What do we make of Salmond? Why isn't Salmond more front and centre of this party?
That's a good question, isn't it? I don't quite understand this. Ash Regan is their only MSP, isn't she? She's the only person from that party in there. He's the sort of eminence in the background. But he said to the Scottish First Minister, OK, fine, we're very willing to sort of help you as long as you promise at the next election to make sure that there are Alba candidates in all the various places, obviously very, very strong supporters of independence, rather than your SNP colleagues. Again, you know, that's sort of rather inviting someone to write a political suicide note.
No. I mean, in getting out of a coalition, the SNP now finds itself in a coalition with the very people it didn't want to be in coalition with, potentially. So it's not great politics. Mail on Sunday's got a really interesting spread by the political editor Glenn Owen on the idea of the EU aping the Rwanda scheme. I mean, do you agree with me that Sunak's had a good week on this?
I think, yes, I suppose he has. He's got through. I mean, my line, which I think I've said to you and I've said in various other places on GB News, I'm still one of those who thinks the Rwanda scheme is fairly barking. I have to be honest. But in political terms, yes, he's sort of done well on that. But this is extraordinary. Apparently, Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, has said that all European countries should be thinking about sending migrants that they don't want to third countries. Well, if that is true, and it seems extraordinary that more is not being made of this. Great story for the Mail on Sunday, and look to see if it gets followed up. It does sound like backing for him, but mind you, you know. What a sort of dog's breakfast European politics generally is, and the EU is.
But it's interesting because obviously this is an argument that's been made by sort of left-wing progressives that this is inhuman, that it won't work, that it's illegal, and then you find that other European countries are trying to ape the scheme, which I think is an endorsement for Rishi Sunak. Breakfast earlier was looking at this issue of migrants now diverting to Ireland, and the Irish are up in arms about it. Again, former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, very much on the progressive side of things, talking about care and compassion for immigrants. But at the end of the day, there are too many people coming into Europe, and all of these different leaders are trying to do something about it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it shouldn't be forgotten that we're not the only people to have this problem by any means.
No.
And I mean, in places like Greece and parts of Italy and so on, and Spain, they all have this issue to deal with. So if there could be some sort of common view on it could be got, that would be marvellous. But again, it seems like a very unlikely at the moment.
I'll be asking Chris Philp, the policing minister who's on for the government later, you know, will these flights definitely take off? And does he think it is going to have that deterrent effect? So stay tuned for that. I thought I'd ask you, just in your capacity as a former newsreader, about Rageh Omaar. That's the ITV news anchor. He was on air and basically he had an episode of illness. We don't know what it is. It's not even fair to speculate because we aren't medical professionals. He said that he wanted to finish the news even though it was apparent that he wasn't very well. Presumably, I mean, he will have just insisted on going on air. Can you identify with this, Nick? What do you think's happened here?
Of course, I can identify. I know Rageh well, and a great, fan of his, if that's the right expression for it. A very distinguished correspondent, great presenter these days. Yes, of course, you want to finish the job. If you sit in the sort of chair that you're in now, and being on camera, aware that 1 million people and more are watching you, you're not just going to say, "Oh, I don't think I feel terribly well. I'm really good." Of course, he wanted to plough on. Very, very difficult situation for him. I can remember going in the studio once or twice thinking, I don't feel particularly 100% today. But usually, you know, Dr. Theatre, if that's the right way, Dr. Studio takes over it and you get through it. Poor man didn't get through it. Apparently he didn't seem terribly well the previous night either. So I suppose my dear colleagues, I worked at ITN for many years very, very happily, should they perhaps have stepped in and just insisted? I don't quite know how that would have worked.
It's really hard, though, with the talent, especially if he's done all of the preparation and all of the scripts and he's across all of the stories.
Yes. Let's just wish him well. That's the important
wish him
thing.
really well. We hope he's OK. And then you were really interested in the story on the front of the Sunday Times about the Soviet traitor, Anthony Blunt. There's been a new revelation. It's fascinating, this, Nick.
Yes, apparently he's suspected of having passed secrets to the Nazis.
Yes.
I wasn't sure whether it was during the war or before the war. So much going on this morning. I haven't read all the fine details.
But he could have been the kind of mystical Josephine figure that passed Allied secrets onto the Nazis back in the day before he was even involved with the sort of Cold War spying.
Yes, well, that tells you that Anthony Blunt wasn't just sort of somehow in favour of Soviet communism and thought that was a wonderful thing. He was also hated this country so much that he would be prepared to sell secrets or give secrets to the fascists as well. Extraordinary, if true.
It's a good revelation by the Sunday Times. Nick Owen, thank you very much for being here this morning. Lovely to have your wisdom on all of this morning's newspapers. Thank you very much. Well, coming up next, former Energy Minister Graham Stewart will be joining me. Does the government need to axe some of its green pledges to win the next general election? Don't go anywhere.
GB News is Britain's election channel. And from Thursday, the 2nd of May,
the people decide.
As the country heads to the polls in a rush of elections.
We'll take you through the night as the first results come in.
And we'll pick up at breakfast
with the very best guests and analysis.
And on the weekend, the results won't stop, and neither will we.
We'll explore what it all means for you as we look ahead to the general election.
Continuing coverage live from Thursday, the 2nd of May at midnight on GB News.
Nana Queer, weekends from 3 p.m.
J.K. Rowling has accused politicians of snuggling up to trans campaigners. The Harry Potter author has called for an investigation into why political parties are embracing the language of pro-trans groups. So is it time to ditch campaign groups such as those? Well, welcome again to my clashers, former Labour Party advisor Matthew Laza, and also businessman and activist Adam Brooks.
I think the Cass report is really welcome. I think there's been a huge amount of agreement, including from some trans rights campaigners, that there's an awful lot of good in the Cass report. I think that I'm more concerned about mermaids, which is currently under a Charity Commission investigation, and some of the reports, if they're to be believed, like sending out chest binders, are more alarming. I think on Stonewall, which has done such great work over the past 30 years on LGBT rights.
It said 2-year-olds could be trans. Now, that is one of the most horrifying things I read today. Actually, J.K. Rowling tweeted that out there. To say that a 2-year-old can think that they can be another gender when my 4-year-old still thinks she's Elsa on some days. You know, there's no common sense, and to me, it's
very badly phrased.
It's very sinister that these people actually believe that these kids want to change gender, and unfortunately out there are parents that almost see a trans kid as a fashion accessory now, and I think this whole agenda has pushed on people that this is normal to change gender, and we have to push back. And as I said earlier, to be trans is not normal.
Well, I don't agree with that
extreme.
phrasing. I think it's a big step, Adam, but there are clearly people throughout history who have been
But it's
trans.
not normal behaviour, is it?
I think as far as children are concerned, children need to be given the space to explore the world, and that can include experimenting with, breaking previous gender stereotypes. That doesn't mean that people should be sort of labelled at the age of 2, which I completely disagree with.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to GB News. You're watching the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm delighted to be joined now by former Energy Minister Graham Stewart, the Tory MP for Beverley and Holderness. Graham, lovely to see you. Do you mind if I call you Graham?
Not at all,
I think we know each other enough for me to call you Graham. Now, you decided to resign from government, which I thought was really intriguing because MPs aren't without ambition, and you were doing very well in your brief. Why did you decide to step down? You said it was to focus on constituency matters more.
Yeah, well, I'd been a minister for nearly all of the last 8 years, and just decided it was time to step back, concentrate on the constituency, get myself a little, slimmer, fitter, and re-elected.
But I mean, are you worried about... I noticed that your majority is 20,000. I know you'll be familiar with the Frank Lund's theory that if you're a Tory with a majority of under 14,000, then you might not be safe. You're 6,000 above that threshold. But did you feel the need to sort of return back to your patch because you feel you do have to shore up support?
Well, not necessarily to win, although you're always best to treat your seat as a marginal seat. If you don't, then, the public can decide that you're taking them for granted and chuck you out. So I enjoy being a constituency MP. I always have. So I enjoyed being on the back benches. I loved being a minister, and it was great to serve and contribute through the energy crisis, which was, as you might imagine, quite stressful at the time. But we really pulled that off, putting in place all the schemes that supported families, businesses. We even had to stand one up for Northern Ireland. I just pay tribute to a lot of people talk about civil servants and whether they're all working from home. And the team at BEIS and now at DESNZ, the Energy Security Department, really are quite remarkable. People worked phenomenally hard. And to land a scheme in Northern Ireland, which we weren't even legally responsible for, make sure that every family got the support they were supposed to have, and have that go off without a hitch, was a tremendous achievement. And it was done under incredible time pressure. So I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of what we've done on the international net zero space. We really have led the global conversation. And one of the first things the president of the COP in Dubai mentioned when he announced the very positive result from that conference was the support of Alison Campbell, my chief negotiator, who'd been a key part of the team drafting what is an historic agreement, the UAE consensus.
OK. I mean, let's get into some of those green policies and indeed some of these targets. Was that the COP that you had to fly back from?
It was,
because of the shoring up. What was that? Why did you fly back? Remind me.
It was, I think it was Rwanda. Again.
Yes, they needed your vote on Rwanda.
Yeah.
I mean, some people look at COP, everyone flying into Dubai by private jet, and think it's a massive load of hot air.
Yeah, well, I was said partly just to deal with that and maintain some sense of humour, is that I'm saving the planet one flight at a time. But necessarily...
But isn't that an oxymoron? I mean, is there a point to saying, look, actually, if this summit is just a talking shop that doesn't achieve very much, and you always get the environmental campaigners saying, you know, they've not gone far enough, what's the point? You can forgive the voters for asking the same question, can't you?
No, exactly. Well, that's why I quite like making that joke. It just acknowledges the fact that you do have to get together, and these ridiculous conferences with so many thousands of people coming together, I can see the absurdity of them, except they have made a difference. And if you look at, you know, the science is ever more stark, showing that the world is getting hotter. That means there's more energy in the system. It comes out in all sorts of ways, most of which are negative. And if you look at, you know, if you did want to do the maths on impact of COP, the savings on emissions absolutely dwarf the actual cost of doing it. And so, yeah, but all of us are made hypocrites by this because, you know, protesters who may or may not be right to protest are typically coming using fossil fuels to get there. They were using fossil fuel-based clothing. It's a transition and it makes hypocrites of us all. But what I'm clear on is the science says that we do need to act. We need the whole world to act because the critics, you know, many of which you'll hear on GB News, and say, what's the point? We're less than 1%. Well, they're right to say that.
Yeah, well, let's drill into that. Okay. They are right to say that, aren't they? Because I think also looking at COP, many people are asking, well, what about China? There's always the what about China element to the conversation, which I know some of the Green Brigade dismiss. But this idea that we are responsible for lowering the world's temperature as Britain, our emissions have come down exponentially, haven't they?
50%. The world's first major economy to halve emissions.
So we've done really, really well. And you can understand the argument from the taxpayer sort of tearing its hair out, saying, well, what more do you want us to do when you've got, I think, the statistic is that China is responsible for 30% of all global emissions, and that in the last 8 years, China has emitted more carbon dioxide than the UK since the start of the Industrial Revolution. To quote Sir Tony Blair, don't ask us to do a huge amount when, frankly, whatever we do in Britain is not really going to impact climate change. This is a legitimate argument to make, isn't it?
It is, and it's one that should be properly aired. People should... I'm in trouble with too many people on the sort of green side of the argument is that it's such a level of zealotry. They don't listen and hear. It is a legitimate point, but... Yeah, I think of it because I have an amazing commons in Beverley. If we're all dependent on one common, a whole load of us, to live, and if we destroy that common, we're all going to starve. You can sit around going, well, I've done more than someone else, why should I do it? In truth, we have to get on with it, and we have to save it because there is only one common, and we're all dependent on it. And the UK has taken a lead, but there's no point if others don't follow. That's why we hosted COP26. We got the world to sign up. Before we hosted that, it was just 30% of global wealth covered by net zero pledges, in which case those sceptics' arguments would have even more weight. After we finished, it was 90%. Yeah. And last year at COP28, the world, including China and India and other major emitters, signed up to produce a pathway to 2035, which is 1.5 degree aligned. The world hasn't done anything like enough through these COPs, but instead of perhaps a 4 degree increase in global temperature, we've got it down to perhaps 3, perhaps a little less. We need to go further, and we do so cooperatively. The rest of the world is following. And so going back to the next question, which would come, well, you know, what's the point of us doing it? And if we do, are we going to bankrupt ourselves? Well, the rest of the world is following. If you look at Europe, other countries that are moving, if the UK can lead, and so far we've transformed our renewables. It was less than 7% of our electricity was Labour's legacy in 2010. Now it's pushing up towards half. We've done that in a way which is cost effective. We've come up with great systems like contracts for difference, which help drive down those costs. If we do it right, we can develop our economy for the future, future-proof it, because the world is going that way, and we can come out with more jobs and more prosperity as a result of doing the right thing on the environment, rather than losing out. But it isn't without a cost.
Well,
and you might want to say to me, how much is it going to cost by 2050?
It's really tempting to say that, and of course we can't ever get any answers. So this idea that it's going to be easy or indeed cost efficient to decarbonise the economy by 2050. The other thing I think that irritates people is, what is it with the setting of these arbitrary targets that seem to have just been pulled out of the air? If it's not 2030, it's 2035. You know, now we're looking towards 2050. Do you have any approximation of the cost?
Well, it is hard to put your finger on it, because when we went into the North Sea to do offshore wind, we did our first auction in 2015. I think it was around £120 a megawatt hour was the minimum that companies would accept. 2 auctions later, it had come down to £39.50. No one could predict that. So I know on the one hand it seems absurd. Here's a former net zero minister, you ask him a straightforward question, how much it's going to cost, he can't tell you, it's all a shambles. It's not. It's so big and it's so complex. It's hard to put a precise figure on it. But the science about the need to act globally is there and ever more stark. The world has indicated and recognised that science and the need to act, and we are in the lead. Now, we mustn't, and the Prime Minister's been clear on this, we're not going to sacrifice UK consumers. But if we can maintain our global lead, keep the lights on, and actually in the 2030s we expect electricity costs, thanks to moving to renewables, to come down. We will reduce our dependence on foreign fossil fuels, which, as we've seen over the last 3 years, can be bankrupting when the price goes up.
The British definitely want to do that.
Yeah.
But what about the whole 80-20 theory? So, for instance, say the ban on petrol and diesels. Wouldn't it have been better to say, actually, we want to move people onto hybrids because we appreciate that there are some long journeys that require petrol. We don't have enough charging points. Therefore, if we're saying to people you're using the hybrid aspect, the electric aspect of your car 80% of the time because 80% of journeys are closer to home, and only using petrol for that 10 to 20%, then we've done really, really well. Instead, you've come out with this arbitrary ban, which I don't know. It seems to we don't seem to be ready for it. We don't seem to have enough charging points to begin with, and also making of batteries costs, you know, the environment gravely. Even the sourcing of some of the lithium and all the rest of it, you know, seems to be sending children, you know, up slag heaps or whatever. So you can understand the frustration of the GB audience, sort of saying, have you actually put the infrastructure in place to achieve some of these arbitrary targeted aims?
Well, and again, that's a good question. And it is about being pragmatic as we go forward. And the Prime Minister's been clear on that. So that's why in September he said that the 2030 target has been moved back to 2035, not because we're resiling from our aims, but because we want to make sure we reassure the public. You've got to carry the public with you and get all those pieces which need to come together at the same time. So we've seen recently a 50% increase just in the last year in the number of charge points. So you kind of get the story, everyone's moving away from electric cars because there aren't the charge points, even as it scales up. And people will not commercially put in charge points if there aren't the electric cars. People won't buy the electric cars if they don't have the charge points.
People won't buy the heat pumps.
And they won't do it unless they've got...
But they won't buy heat pumps if they don't heat their homes adequately.
Well, I've got a heat pump at my home and it does a fantastic job. We need to look at rebalancing the kind of system costs, as we call them, between electricity and gas.
How much did it cost you to install that heat pump?
I think it was my house was already ready for it, so I think it was about £8,500.
Which is a lot of money. I mean, if you'd had a boiler installed, it would have probably cost £2,000.
Yeah, but my bills are extraordinarily low. As it happens, I'm not saying this is...
I mean, it's going to take years for you to recoup the cost of the bills. If you're on low income, how on earth are you expected to pay for that?
That's exactly why we again in September, the Prime Minister announced a 50% increase in the subsidy of it. It was up to £7,500 per heat pump to help do that. And we're bringing down, as I say, the cost of electricity relative to gas, because at the moment we've disproportionately put bills on electricity and not gas, which goes against kind of nonsensical. So that has to be rebalanced, which is always the people you make happy, you never make as happy as the people you make unhappy.
Well, that is
in
true.
the best advice ever given to ministers. So that has to be managed. But we're on a practical path, and we can, if you're a uber green, the UK has done more than any other major economy on earth, and we should be proud of that. And to the GB viewers who are sceptical, I'd say we are doing it in a practical way.
Graham,
the Prime Minister is listening.
We've had a very, I think, intelligent discussion about this topic this morning, and I'm grateful for your insight. Thank you very much, Graham Stewart, for coming in this morning. Lots more to come. I'm going to be speaking to the Policing Minister, Chris Philp, in just a moment, and Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Don't go anywhere.
We've blown the budget by giving you the chance to win a totally terrific £20,000 in tax-free cash to make your summer spectacular. You could use that cash to splash out on a holiday, make the garden glam, buy a new car, or just save it for a rainy day. Whatever you'd spend £20,000 on, make sure you don't miss the chance to make it yours. For a chance to win £20,000 in tax-free cash, text WIN to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB05 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 31st of May. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Squatters in London have taken over a pub which is leased by Gordon Ramsay, no less. The pub is currently up for sale with a guide price of £30 million. It is understood that Kitchen Nightmares host Ramsay called the police on Wednesday but was unable to have the squatters removed. The Metropolitan Police said in a statement they were made aware of squatters at a disused property but added, "This is a civil matter," and so police did not attend the property. Let's see what my panel make of this. Well, why can't we just boot squatters out? If we own a property or lease a property, why don't we just boot them out?
I know that's tempting, but the fact is, long-term empty properties have increased by 24% in the last 6 years. There's 1.2 million people on the social housing lists. People don't have a place to live.
What it does highlight is the enormous disparity in fairness in property laws in this country. I mean, it's just not fair that if you've worked all your life and invested some money in property because, you know, interest rates at zero and there's nowhere else to invest your money, and then suddenly somebody who's got no claim to that property and doesn't seem to have earned very much in life takes over your property. It's an outrage.
People shouldn't be squatting in other people's homes or commercial properties. But the fact is, until we sort the housing problem in this country, none of this is going to go away. The fact is, people my age won't be able to buy a home unless they've got a bung from their parents.
Yeah, but what's the practicality of this demonstration?
It's not a demonstration.
It's not going to free up more housing for people who are on the streets.
No, of course not. It's people looking to find a place to live. I don't think it's a demonstration at all.
It's an anti-wealth, anti-property owning demonstration by people who've got nothing better to do in life than break into other people's property.
Welcome back. So much more to come in the next hour. I'm going to be joined by Policing Minister Chris Philp and the Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. But first, here's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you and good morning. The top stories. The defection of a Tory MP to the Labour Party in anger over the NHS crisis has added pressure on the Prime Minister ahead of an expected tough week for Rishi Sunak. Conservative MP Dr Dan Poulter defected, saying the Tories are now a nationalist party of the right. Dr Poulter said he'd sit as a Labour MP until the general election, then stand down. His decision is another blow to the Prime Minister's authority just days before the party faces local elections across England and and Wales on the 2nd of May. Meanwhile, Mr Sunak has again this morning refused to rule out a general election in July, amid speculation a disastrous set of local election results for the Tories could force his hand. Political commentator Peter Spencer says things could not be worse for the Prime Minister.
It is confidently predicted that the Conservatives will lose hundreds and hundreds of seats and possibly 2 metro mayors. So we've been hearing in recent days about how Sunak has had a reset, yet another reset. They're sorting out welfare reforms and getting Rwanda through and increasing defence spending, but all that will just be blown right out of the water come Friday, when the sums have been done and the Tories realise just how badly the voters judge them.
Well, the Prime Minister has tried to bolster his premiership this week with announcements including the passing of Rwanda asylum legislation, among other pledges. But former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick has this morning called for a cap on net immigration, claiming a far more restrictive system is needed. Jenrick has called for a cap of less than 100,000 a year, arguing it's the only way to restore voters' trust. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, he says the government's recently passed Rwanda bill will soon join the graveyard of policies that failed to tackle illegal migration, but called legal migration a bigger scandal. According to Mr Jenrick, net migration needs to be scaled back to the tens of thousands. He resigned as Immigration Minister last year in protest at the Prime Minister's Rwanda deportation plan, saying it wasn't a strong enough deterrent for illegal migrants entering the country. The Alba Party MSP, whose vote could be crucial to Scotland's First Minister, says it's time to build relationships, but the price of her support will be higher, as Humza Yousaf dithers. Ash Regan hasn't confirmed how she'll vote in the motions of no confidence at Holyrood, expected to take place in the coming week. Writing in the Sunday Mail, she said she will only use her vote in the way that'll be best for Scotland. Meanwhile, Yousaf is asking leaders of rival parties to find common ground with the SNP as his leadership hangs in the balance. It comes after the collapse of the SNP's power-sharing deal with the Greens. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Camilla.
Thanks, Tatiana. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lots more still to come. In just a minute, I'm going to be getting to the bottom of Labour's NHS plans with Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. I'll also be speaking to the former Brexit Secretary, Sir David Davis, as he plans to abseil down Anfield later on today for a cause very close to his heart. I'll also be joined by Policing Minister Chris Philp as the march against anti-Semitism was called off this weekend over security fears, should the government be putting a stop to the pro-Palestinian marches once and for all. Former Defence Secretary Dr Liam Fox will be here sharing his latest book, The Coming Storm, and I'll be joined later by former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, whose new report looks at how we can tackle migration and whether we need a legal migration cap. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by former Brexit Secretary Sir David Davis, Conservative MP for Halton, Price and Howden. David, let's not talk about politics. Let's talk about why on earth you have decided to abseil down Anfield today.
Well, it's to raise money, basically, for research for a disease called SYNGAP1. Most people have never heard of it. My granddaughter suffers from it. It's in her case, a single mistake in her DNA. Imagine a single spelling error in a novel, you know? And what it does is it means she's now 10 years old, she's still non-verbal. She has seizures, if you like, electric storms in her head about 10 times a day or more. And because this is only detected when you have a full genetic test, there are only a few hundred people known about it. I suspect thousands suffer from it, children suffer from it. But the simple truth is that because it's only hundreds measured, there's very little research funding for it. And so I'm raising money to help that research, to encourage that research, so we can get a cure. That's it in a nutshell. And I'm dressed up in my rugby shirt today because it's very cold wind off the Irish Sea, I understand.
Well, I was thinking it's probably not the best conditions to be doing this. It's pouring with rain seemingly across the whole of the country. So tell me, I mean, you've abseiled before. I think we might even have, for at least those watching, for those listening on GB News Radio, got a picture here of David Davis. I think it looks like it's circa early 90s, abseiling up something or down something. So, I mean, you have abseiled before. You're a pro at this, are you, David?
Yeah, that's quite a small abseil you got there. There's a crag in the north of England. It's about 15 years ago. As you can tell by my hair colour is better than it is now. But yeah, you're right. The weather will make it a bit harder. I've abseiled once in the snow. I've never abseiled in the rain, so the rope will be hard to handle. But you know, I don't see any problems with it. Frankly, I'll have more difficulty with the health and safety measures being imposed than actually on the abseiling. But nevertheless, you know, it's symbolic. It's for a cause. It's to deliver some money to solve this, to try and solve this problem. And you know, bear in mind, you've got SYNGAP 1, you've got Fragile X, you've got all sorts of autism. There are lots of diseases that depend on genetic failures. And if we solve this particular problem, it'll solve a lot of, well, it'll prevent a lot of Chloe's my granddaughter. A lot of Chloe's suffering in the future from this. So we got a thing on GoFundMe. It's SYNGAP1, SYNGAP1.
All right, brilliant, David. Thank you very much. We'll try and get that on our website as well. All the very best with it. Just be careful, and lots of love to Chloe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary and Labour MP for Ilford North. Hopefully not too wet, Mr Streeting. Sorry you're having to stand there in the rain. It's a grotty day. Let's start by talking about this defection.
Don't worry, I'm undercover, actually, so I'm OK.
Oh, good. Good. Let's start by talking about the defection of Dan Poulter. This intrigues me. It's giving me memories of Quintin Davies defecting to Labour in 2007. And then, lo and behold, 3 years later, he ends up with a life peerage. I'm wondering what Labour and Keir Starmer must have promised Mr Poulter in return for this defection.
Well, Dan Poulter's leaving Parliament at the general election to go back full-time to the NHS. So I think it speaks volumes that, you know, he's not leaving the Conservative Party to save his seat. He's leaving the Conservative Party to save the NHS. And I think that there'll be millions of people, disaffected Conservative voters like Dan Poulter out there, who can see the chaos in the Conservative Party, see the failure to deliver, and are looking at the alternative. And I'd ask those people to trust the doctor, who's seen the Conservative Party up close, has seen the changed Labour Party of Keir Starmer up close, and has decided that ultimately we need a Labour government in this country to get our NHS back on its feet, to turn the economy around, and to make sure that we can look to the future with hope and optimism again. Because, you know, the Conservatives have had enough chances, enough Prime Ministers, and enough time now, and they've failed. Objectively, they've failed.
But obviously, him standing down wouldn't preclude him from being offered a peerage in the House of Lords. So can you categorically confirm that Labour haven't offered him a peerage or anything else?
Not that I'm aware of, and I spoke to Dan just this week. I mean, frankly, I think he'd be a great addition, but that's certainly not my decision, and I'm not aware of such an offer.
Do you think that Labour's performance on the NHS in Wales is enough evidence to suggest that a Labour government would do better with the NHS?
Well, people can judge Labour on our record when we were last in government, the shortest waiting times, the highest patient satisfaction on record. But I don't deny, by the way, there are challenges in the NHS in Wales and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and right across England. And what all of those countries and regions of the United Kingdom have in common is the Conservatives having been in power in Westminster. And one of the things that I often say, as the person who wants to be the next health secretary and would be the health secretary for England, is that the pledges we've made, the 2 million more appointments a year, or mental health support in every primary and secondary school in the country, or more scanners, and I could list the rest. All of those, because of the investment that goes in there, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all benefit. So I think the next Labour government will be able to create a rising tide that lifts all ships across the UK. OK,
but what's the point of devolution then, if it's all Westminster's fault that, for instance, Welsh Labour is now presiding over record high waiting lists? I mean, that's Welsh Labour's responsibility, isn't it? That's what devolution's all about.
It does give governments across the United Kingdom freedom to make their own decisions and do things their own way, but all of those governments are ultimately tied to the fiscal decisions and the economic fortunes of the country and what happens in Westminster. And that's why right across the UK you see public services under pressure, you see the NHS going through the worst crisis in its history. There are some things that the NHS in Wales does better than the NHS in England, by the way, and I think particularly about community services and community care and the care my grandmother received, for example, when she was dying late last year. I couldn't fault the district nursing team, and I thought actually she's getting better care in North Wales than she would have done if she lived in England, and I was grateful for that. But we've got to work together, and I think what the Dan Poulter defection also shows is that the Labour Party can build a big tent to unite our country in pursuing not just the public service reforms, but the economic policies our country needs. And bear in mind, as well as Dan Poulter, we've had Richard Walker, the chairman of Iceland, former Conservative, now backing Labour for business. You've got Nick Bowles, who helped David Cameron prepare for government before the 2010 election, a former Conservative minister, saying Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves offer serious leadership. So I really do think that the country is crying out for change. I hope people vote for that change at the general election, whenever the Prime Minister plucks up the courage to call it.
Are you going to have more defections then? Who else are you speaking to?
Look, I don't think Dan Poulter is the only Conservative who's been considering his future. I think what Dan Poulter's defection shows and the way in which he's been received by parliamentary colleagues is people would be very welcome to come across to the Labour Party. We want to build that big tent, and we want people, when the general election comes, to vote Labour, particularly in those tight races between Labour and the Conservatives. We're appealing to, as well as to former Conservative voters, we're also appealing to Liberal Democrat and Green voters to lend us those votes in those races. We want to work together to build the future our country needs.
Talking about the future that our country needs, I note that you have committed to keeping the triple lock on pensions. Will you keep the new defence spending pledge at 2.5% of GDP?
Well, Keir Starmer actually set out Labour's commitments 2.5% a few weeks back on the front page of the Mail, and I'm sure that had absolutely nothing at all with the Prime Minister's hasty announcement this week. I think what we do need, though, is, and actually on a really serious note here, I think if we can have a genuine cross-party consensus on 2.5%, I think not only is that the right decision for our country, I think it does a great service in sending a strong message, not just to our allies, but also to our adversaries, that no matter who's in government after the next general election, we are committed to Britain's security, to our continent's security, especially with the war raging in Ukraine, and that Britain will be a force for good in the world.
Although the man who hopes to be the next Foreign Secretary did once propose scrapping Trident. Presumably he's now changed his mind, like you've changed your mind when you now don't believe that trans women are women.
Well, as the book of Luke reminds us, God loves a repentant sinner, and a repentant sinner is worth more than the 95 people who, do have nothing to repent for. Look, we are unequivocally committed to the renewal of the nuclear deterrent. And by the way, I mean, I might as well own up. When I was a student activist, I think I signed letters calling for Trident to be scrapped. And I'm really glad that the last Labour government didn't pay any attention to those troublemaking students like me, because the thing about the nuclear deterrent is not only has it worked, objectively worked, we have not seen conflict between nuclear powers as a result of that deterrent. You never know what's around the corner in this volatile and changing world. And the problem is, once you scrap it, it's hard to replace and takes time to replace. So we are unequivocally committed to keeping Trident. About that, there should be no doubt whatsoever.
It might just be worth noting that Labour did elect one of those troublemaking students as leader for many years, under whom Keir Starmer happily served, Jeremy Corbyn, but I digress. Another very quick question for you, Wes, if you don't mind. Do you think that Keir Starmer should apologise to Rosie Duffield? She was the one who was railing against this talk of trans women being women. She's had an horrendous ordeal She says Labour have a woman problem. No one seems to be acknowledging that Rosie Duffield was right all along, wasn't she?
Look, well, firstly, I and other Labour colleagues have condemned the abuse that Rosie has received. I actually don't agree with what she said this week about the Labour Party. I mean, we should never be complacent about sexism and discrimination in politics, but you look at Labour's top team, you've got Angela Rayner, who'll be Deputy Prime Minister, Rachel Reeves, who'll be Chancellor of the Exchequer, Yvette Cooper, who'll be the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, who will be the Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor of our country. You look at Sue Gray, Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Women play a big role in Labour's team and will continue to do so. And I very much hope Rosie will be part of that Labour team after the general election too. No, we've not had a woman leader yet, and I've no doubt that in my lifetime that will happen. What we do have, though, in Keir Starmer is a great alternative to Rishi Sunak. And look, I'll take you what you said about Jeremy Corbyn earlier. Jeremy Corbyn is not a Labour MP. He is not going to be a Labour candidate in the next general election, and that's because Keir Starmer showed the strength and leadership to withdraw the whip. If only Rishi did that with some of the people in his party who are beyond the pale. But the difference is Keir's a strong leader with a mandate. Rishi Sunak is a weak politician who is out of control of his party.
All right, well, he withdrew the whip after working with and for Jeremy Corbyn for 4 years in shadow cabinet, Mr Streeting, but I take your point. It's a new and changed Labour Party, is what you're saying.
Yep, absolutely. I just don't think there's any doubt about that now, and we all tried to influence the Labour Party as best we could during those years. Some of us outside the tent, people like Keir inside the tent, but I've no doubt about where Keir's politics are, where his convictions are, and you know, thank goodness he was in the tent, because things could have been worse, and thank goodness he's leading the Labour Party now, because it's unrecognisable from the party that was rejected in 2019, and that's why I think lots of GB News viewers are looking to Labour. We'll continue to come on your programmes, continue to make our case, and work really hard to win the trust of your viewers, because we want your support of the general election.
Well, we'll happily give you the trust of the viewers and the listeners if Keir Starmer actually agreed to come on my show. Perhaps you can have a word with him, Mr Streeting, as we always enjoy our exchanges, don't we?
I will put in a recommendation, Camilla. I bet he'd love to come and be interviewed by you, but I'll pass that on.
All right, good man. Thank you very much, Wes Streeting. Lovely to speak to you this morning.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. In just a minute, I'm going to be speaking to Policing Minister Chris Philp. Does he still have confidence in Met Police Chief Sir Mark Rowley?
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
SUV drivers in Oxford will face higher parking charges. Proposals tabled by the local Green Party or passed by the City Council. The motion argues that heavier cars like SUVs cause more damage to roads, are more likely to seriously injure or kill pedestrians, and cause more illnesses due to pollution. However, the Alliance of British Drivers has condemned the plan as absolutely outrageous. Well, let's get the thoughts now of the legendary motoring journalist, Quentin Wilson. Quentin, welcome to the show. Always a pleasure. We hear a lot about the war on motorists, this time targeting SUVs because of their weight, and the charges could be astronomical. This idea first started in Paris. Now it's coming to Oxford. Can you tell us a bit about how it would work?
OK, so the idea is that the charges will penalise people who drive heavier SUVs, and I guess by implication electric cars, although Oxford Council haven't said exactly what they're going to do with EVs. But this is all based around this notion of SUVs being heavier than passenger cars, therefore wearing out the roads more. Now, there was a study, I've got it here in front of me, from the University of Edinburgh in 2022 that said real-world tests found that overwhelmingly the wear is caused by large vehicles, buses, heavy good vehicles. Road wear from cars and motorcycles is so low that this is immaterial. Now, obviously, driving around a medieval city like Oxford in an SUV isn't the brightest thing in the world to do. But the idea that we should penalise the owners of these cars based on imperfect science that's been read on social media, I think is completely wrong.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Lovely to have your company this Sunday morning. I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Liam Fox, Conservative MP for North Somerset, because he's got this book out, The Coming Storm. And this is a really interesting topic, Liam, that, to be honest, I haven't given much thought to, and now, having read some of this book, I feel I should give more to it, because you're basically saying that you think water will write the history of the 21st century with profound implications for both humanity and the planet. So let's just start by saying, what do you mean by that? Water will write the history of the 21st century.
Well, I wanted to write the book for three reasons. Number one, that I have a profound belief that every human being has an absolute human right to clean water and sanitation. Secondly, the competition for water as the population grows but the water supply doesn't is a potential cause of conflict around the world. And thirdly, the absolute scandal of how much garbage we're putting into the seas and oceans, which is a crime against the environment. And everyone talks about CO2 and so on, but we're actually poisoning the seas around us. And these things together, I think, create a huge momentum for potential problems as we go into the rest of the century.
One of the points you make in the book really strongly is this relationship between China and Tibet over water and access to fresh water. Now, again, you'd think that, you know, some of China's behaviour on the global stage was motivated by other factors, but you seem to be coming to conclusion that a lot of it is about water. Just explain that for our audience.
So you've got a number of different things coming together here. And of course, we're not very good at joining the dots because foreign policies in one place, defence policies in another, climate policies in a different one. Just take that case of Tibet. About 40% of all the people on our planet today get either their drinking, their agricultural or industrial water from a river that arises on the Tibetan plateau, the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Mekong, Yellow, Yangtze. China now controls the headwaters of all of those. And the waters in Tibet have a particular problem, that the glaciers are actually melting faster than anywhere else in the world. Why, you might ask? The answer is not just the amount of CO2 that's going into the atmosphere from China and India, but what they actually burn. And because they burn coal, it leaves a very thin black layer on top of the snow that actually absorbs heat rather than reflecting it. So the argument's much more than just how much CO2 we produce. It's also what we use to produce it and the impact that has on other things. And there are about 56,000 dams in the world, and about 28,000 of them are in China. China's getting ready to be able to harness water if it becomes an issue of shortage.
And do you also think that water has played a part in some of the conflicts in the Middle East? That's another conclusion I think you draw in this book.
Well, we've long known, for example, the Euphrates Basin in Iraq and Syria and the Jordan Basin in Israel. These are areas where competition for water has always been a potential cause for conflict. A little further down in Africa, you've now got Ethiopia having filled the Grand Renaissance Dam. Now, when I wrote the book more than 10 years ago, the argument was that no one would ever allow Ethiopia to build this dam because it would have control over the Nile, and Egypt and Sudan wouldn't allow it. Well, they didn't have the military capabilities to stop it. Now Ethiopia effectively can turn the Blue Nile on and off. Not to say that they will, but you've got this growing tension between what we might call the upstream countries in the world, the ones that control the headwaters, and the downstream countries who depend on them. So you're going to have an increasing tension there. And as we suffer from more pollution, as we suffer from more drought, as we suffer from a bigger population, you can see where these tensions take us.
I mean, are we doing quite well? I had Graham Stewart on earlier and he was talking about, you know, this net zero target and all the rest of it. We're doing well, aren't we, in bringing our emissions down in the UK? We're doing well on things like recycling. We don't seem to be doing very well at all when it comes to, just to make it domestic for a moment, our rivers and our seas and how much pollution and sewerage is being pumped into them. I mean, do you think that the water companies need to be doing far more about this? What's your take on that?
Far more. There's too little investment in infrastructure and too much emphasis on dividends.
Yes.
But you also need to keep it in perspective. I was just in Budapest at Easter, sitting on the Danube, which by the time it gets to Budapest is quite clean. But you go further down and you'll discover that even in a bad year like last year in Britain, when we had all that excess flooding and taking some of that waste into the rivers, it is 1/1400th of what goes into the Danube in a normal year.
Wow.
And so we do need to think about these things in a global context. And one of the points I was making in the book is you cannot deal with global problems from a national context. We need to have global agreements. And you know, you've got 4 countries, China, Vietnam, Thailand and Indonesia, putting more plastic into the oceans every year than the whole of the rest of the world combined.
But then you can sense people's frustration. They say, well, we're doing everything we can. We're using 8 different bins. We're separating everything. We're doing our best. And then you get a statistic like that. I mean, when it comes to microplastics in the oceans, is this something that can ever be solved? And I don't want to be negative because I think we have great hope. We have wonderful clean-up operations on British beaches. I know school children particularly have been emboldened to try and clean up the shores. That's wonderful. But microplastics is a problem that's going to be around for decades and decades to come, isn't it?
Well, we've just had our first microplastic snow in Antarctica.
Wow. That's so depressing.
It is literally everywhere on the planet now. And, you know, it's estimated about a quarter of all the fish that are landed in markets in California have some plastic in their gut.
What can we do? I mean,
so we do need
it's too big a problem, it seems, to solve.
Nothing is too big a problem,
okay.
but we need to recognise that we need international cooperation on this. And countries like China, which is the worst culprit in the world, producing about 60 million tonnes of plastic a year, less than a quarter of that's actually recycled. So we need to be getting international agreements on recycling.
How hopeful are you to get agreements with China? I mean, you can speak as well as a former defence secretary. China doesn't have proper representation at things like COP. So it seems like the Western world's banging its head against a brick wall, frankly.
Well, there are other tools. I mean, there's a big debate around should we have a carbon border tax on countries like China who are undercutting us economically by polluting the world more than anyone else. And we also have to get in perspective the timescales and the size of the problem. So Britain produces 1.01% of all the CO2 on the planet. China produces about 29%.
Yes.
So it's all very well talking about net zero targets. What we really need are the big polluters to stop polluting as quickly as possible. And all these problems are linked together: climate, security, trade, what we eat. I made a point in the book that, you know, it takes 1,500 litres of water to produce 1 kilogram of beef, but only about 600 to produce 1 kilogram of chicken. Our dietary habits also have a big impact on how much water is used in different parts of the world.
So you're not advocating vegetarianism, but maybe advocating less red meat and more white meat.
Well, it makes sense to produce things like meat in countries that have got lots of water, but not in countries where water is a shortage. We've got to think ecologically about the balance of trade in the world, something we've not even started to think about.
All right, well, let's show the book again, The Coming Storm by Liam Fox. Hopefully you can see that. I mean, you've delved into a subject that I think probably most people are quite ignorant of, so it's definitely worth a read. And thank you for going through the details of that this morning. It's been lovely to see you in the studio.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Liam Fox. Well, coming up shortly, I'm going to be joined by Policing Minister Chris Philp. Does he still have confidence in Met Police Chief Sir Mark Rowley? I'll be asking him that and other matters. Don't go anywhere.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
Many of the people that you had invited to come and speak were people who've been elected in their own countries. I'm thinking of people like Suella Braverman. I'm thinking of Nigel Farage, who has been a member of the European Parliament, of course, had an enormous impact on British politics. And Viktor Orban, who has been elected and re-elected. Many people may not care for the Prime Minister of Hungary, but he's certainly an elected person.
And in addition, we had about 15 to 16 members of the European Parliament who were also elected, and they really live in Brussels. And you would imagine that Brussels, being the head of the capital of the EU, would allow elected members of its own parliament to have an opportunity to voice their views. So I think what was very interesting about this is that the mayors overplayed their hands, so that because they overplayed their hands, all public opinion became entirely on our side. It was so evident, so transparent, that this was really an attempt to use the police instead of arguments to react to our conference, that it was a real direct threat, and it is still a direct threat to the freedom of assembly and to free speech.
So how do you think it leaves it? Is it more likely or less likely that there'll be future bans?
I think this is a trial run. What I'm really worried about is that if the future of democracy and free speech depends on the ruling of one judge, and you have to remember that 3 other judges ruled against us, then democracy is in big trouble. What worries me absolutely is that a strong body of political opinion amongst established politicians believes that it is okay to cancel conferences and to crush the people's opinions and prevent the freedom of assembly. Democracy actually depends on these foundational values.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking, this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them. Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Stephen Dixon, and thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Now, before I introduce our next guest, we just wanted to clear something up that he said earlier in the week, as we have the benefit of him joining us in person. Let's take a look.
Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes, it is.
Yes, definitely. So you're saying if they come from a war zone in Congo, would they then be sent to Rwanda?
So that was Chris Philp on Question Time earlier in the week. I'm delighted to be joined now by the Policing Minister. He's also the Minister for Crime and Fire, Chris Philp, also the Conservative MP for Croydon South. Now, Minister, I have to clear up this moment with the Rwanda and the DRC comment that you made. I mean, have you been a bit stitched up? Presumably you do know your geography, Mr Philp.
Yeah, and I have actually flown to the DRC in the past, so it was a bit, I think, misinterpreted. I was having a little bit of trouble hearing the question, and the comment I made to the gentleman in the audience, I think, was pretty clearly a rhetorical question rather than a substantive question, as I think any fair-minded listener would conclude.
All right, fair enough. I mean, did you do GCSE geography or A-level geography, so we can clear this up even further?
I did do, I think, GCSE geography, but that was a very long time ago. That was, it was 30 years ago, in fact. It was in 1994.
All right, yeah, about the time I was doing my GCSEs too. I think we must be the same age. Let's move on now and talk about.
It was 1992. In fact, GCSEs was 1992. There we are. 32
you also
years.
did your maths GCSE, Mr. Philp. But anyway, counting's never been my strong point either. Let's talk about the defection of Dan Poulter, can we? I mean, this is a loss to the Conservative Party. Yeah. It's a slap in the face for Rishi Sunak, and it doesn't say much about how a doctor working in the NHS views how the NHS has been managed under 14 years of Conservative rule.
Well, obviously, we're always sad to lose a colleague, although I haven't seen Dan around that much recently. Look, I think the Conservative record on the NHS is very good. Well, I mean, it means what I said. We've got a fantastic record on the NHS. We've got record levels of spending, £165 billion a year, even adjusting for inflation, more than we've ever spent before in history. We've got record numbers of doctors, record numbers of nurses. Just in the last year alone, the NHS has grown by 68,000 staff, and there are today 7,000 more doctors and 21,000 more nurses than there were a year ago. And the numbers are also much higher than they were in 2010. So huge investment going into the NHS, and it's showing results. The waiting lists that obviously grew up during COVID and were exacerbated by the doctors' strike are now falling on a sustained basis. They've fallen by 200,000 across the last 5 months.
OK, so what's motivated this then? Because you're painting a completely different picture of the NHS to a doctor actually working in it, who now says he can't look his patients in the face by remaining as a Conservative.
Well, I mean, obviously he's been working in the NHS in a specific place, and I'm giving you the figures for the NHS as a whole. In terms of his motivation, you'd have to ask him about that. But he says he's joining Labour because he thinks Labour will do a better job. But if you look at what Labour are doing in Wales, where Labour does run the NHS, they are doing an appalling job. Tens of thousands of people each year are fleeing the Welsh-run the Labour-run NHS in Wales to have treatment in England. The waiting lists, the proportion of the public who are on either very long waiting lists or indeed the proportion of the public in Wales on a waiting list at all is higher, materially higher than it is in England. So on any measure, the Labour Party are doing a terrible job. Well, the Labour Party are doing a terrible job running the NHS in Wales. The waiting lists in England have gone up because of COVID and because of the strikes, but they are now coming down on a sustained basis. They've been coming down over the last 5 months. The plan is working and we need to go further.
Let's talk about shoplifting. You said that the police should have a zero-tolerance approach to shoplifting, and yet we still learn that there seems to be this licence to steal up to £200 worth of goods. Have the police not listened to you as Policing Minister, Mr Philp?
Well, a quick bit of wider context, then shoplifting. So crime overall in the last year has fallen by 6%. Those figures came out last week. Overall reduction in crime, reduction in homicide as well. And of course, last year we hit record ever police numbers. Now on shoplifting specifically, just to be clear, stealing goods under the value of £200 is a criminal offence under, I think it's the Theft Act 1968. It is a criminal offence and you can go to prison, I think, for up to 6 months for doing that. So yes, you're right. I've asked the police to take a zero-tolerance approach to shoplifting because it's been going up in the UK as it has in other European countries, and I want to see a crackdown. I want to see zero tolerance. The police have now agreed to do that, and what that means in practice is always, not sometimes, but always following up leads, in particular CCTV evidence that we can now run through the spatial recognition database, which with artificial intelligence is now very accurate. It means attending the scene of the crime where a suspect has been detained, for example by store security staff, where there's been an assault or where attendance is needed to secure evidence. It means going after prolific offenders. It means going after organised criminal gangs. We've got a project called Project Pegasus that is designed to do that. So that is the plan that we've agreed with policing for a zero-tolerance approach, and retailers have reported, we only implemented it a few months ago, retailers have reported seeing improvements already, but we need to actually get these crime numbers, the shoplifting numbers coming down, just like crime more widely is coming down. We need shoplifting to come down as well. We cannot tolerate it at all.
Can we talk about your conversations with Met Police Chief Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley last week? I mean, you've decided that you do have confidence in the Met boss. If you were openly Jewish, you wouldn't, would you?
Well, look, we're obviously very concerned about the Jewish community telling us they feel unsafe at times in the centre of London. And obviously the Home Secretary and I at different times have met various Jewish community leaders as well as the police, of course, and Islamic leaders as well. So, you know, we do want to see London being safe for everybody, including and in particular the Jewish community. And that means making sure people on marches behave in a reasonable way. There have been, I think, well over 500 arrests since October the 7th. In fact, there were 2 arrests yesterday. One, an arrest of somebody who was saying anti-Semitic things to
yeah, but at the same time,
a sort of pro-Israeli supporter. So we do want those people to be protected and looked after.
But it's not equal, is it? The approach to the policing can't be equal if you now have a situation where an anti-Semitism march has had to be cancelled, and we learned this morning that the police have decided to cover over with blue tarpaulin a Holocaust memorial because they're worried about it being defaced. So actually, when Suella Braverman talked about two-tier policing, she was right, wasn't she?
Well, to be clear, the blue tarpaulin wasn't placed there by the Metropolitan Police. I think it was the Royal Parks. And actually, I think it's wrong to cover up memorials in that way, because no memorial, whether it's a war memorial or a Holocaust memorial, should need to be covered up. We need to make sure that the policing operation keeps those memorials safe. In fact, we're actually legislating, as you probably know, to make it a specific criminal offence to climb on particular protected war memorials. And I do want to see the police ensure that Jewish people are always safe. And we've had that conversation with Sir Mark Rowley this week, and we've had conversations with the Jewish community as well.
But if the Royal Parks, thank you for that correction, have had to cover it up, then they're making the conclusion that Holocaust memorials aren't safe in London under Met Chief Police Commissioner Mark Rowley. That's by definition a conclusion also that perhaps Jewish people aren't safe in London. So you're saying that you want them to be safe, but they don't feel safe.
Well, they don't feel safe, that is true, and that's why I think the police need to redouble their efforts, and we've had that conversation with the Commissioner. I know the Jewish community have as well. There have been, thousands and thousands of police officers deployed to police the marches and to police central London more generally. Well over 500 arrests now have been made as well, but what needs to happen, not every single day, day in, day out, is people from particular religious communities need to always feel safe in our country, and that is the message that the Home Secretary and I have unequivocally given to policing. And by the way, that applies to the Jewish community and to the Muslim community.
Yeah.
Everybody should feel safe in our country, and it's the police's duty to make sure that happens.
OK, will you be continuing to review Mark Rowley's position should there be more problems with these pro-Palestinian marches? Very briefly, Mr Philp.
Well, his position hasn't been reviewed. The Home Secretary was clear that he continued to have confidence in Sir Mark, and we will continue to work closely with the Metropolitan Police to make sure, and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, because of course Sadiq Khan is ultimately the politician directly responsible for policing in London, and of course Sadiq Khan has presided over an explosion of knife crime, which is why I think he should be voted out of office on Thursday of this coming week.
All right. OK, Chris Philp, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. I've got some happy news to share next, because I've been nominated for a Trick Award, would you believe, for my interview with the legendary broadcaster Alistair Stewart about his dementia diagnosis. You can still catch up on that, by the way, on YouTube if you didn't see it. It's a really moving interview with Al, as we like to call him here, and Sal, his wife. You can vote for me, believe it or not, and my GB News colleagues. They're all nominated, and all of the nominations are on our website. And you can go to the Trick Awards poll, which is polltrick.org.uk. So poll-trick.org.uk. And there's one of those barcodes on the screen now. So if you're near the television and you've got your phone in front of you, get that up and you can vote for me directly. We need all of the votes to count, because it's kind of it's the public are voting rather than the establishment, which means we might have a chance of winning. You just never know. So please do vote for me, and thank you for your support. Up next, I'm going to be speaking to former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick ahead of his report on migration levels. You won't want to miss it.
Hello, here's your latest weather update for the Met Office for GB News. We'll see an east-west split weather-wise across the UK today. Rain at times towards the east, generally a bit brighter the further west you go, but temperatures still struggling for the time of year. Confirmation then of a pretty wet picture across some central and many eastern parts of England. Towards the southeast we could see skies brightening briefly, but this could set off some pretty heavy, potentially even thundery showers for a time. Whereas towards the west and northwest are generally bright today here, but again notice a few showers dotted around as we go through the day. Temperatures really struggling under the rain towards the east, coupled with quite a strong northerly breeze, no better than 9 or 10 degrees in places here, whereas in the best of the sunshine further west we'll see highs of 12 or 13 Celsius. As we go through the evening into the overnight period, those outbreaks of rain will push away to the northeast, affecting the Northern Isles into the early hours of Monday. Elsewhere, it will turn clearer for a time, but notice further showers gathering out towards the west, some of those starting to merge to longer spells of rain towards the morning. And other clear spells out towards the east, it will turn quite chilly. Could see a local frost by Monday morning in 1 or 2 spots, but generally those temperatures picking back up as these showers come back in across the west there. As for Monday, well, again, an east-west split developing in the weather, but this time a reversal of fortunes, with the east and southeast seeing the best of the dry and bright weather. Whereas out towards the west, there'll be plenty of showers around, those showers again merging at times to some longer spells of rain. And although pretty wet out towards the west, temperatures generally starting to pick up, with highs of 12 or 13 Celsius towards the north, up to 15 or 16 degrees in the southeast.
GB News is Britain's election channel. And from Thursday the 2nd of May,
the people decide.
As the country heads to the polls in a rush of elections.
We'll take you through the night as the first results come in.
And we'll pick up at breakfast
with the very best guests and analysis.
And on the weekend, the results won't stop, and neither will we.
We'll explore what it all means for you as we look ahead to the general election.
Continuing coverage live from Thursday the 2nd of May at midnight on GB News. 2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
We're GB News, and we come from a proud tradition of British journalism.
That's why I'm so excited to be here. It's something so new.
The first news channel to be launched in Britain in over 30 years.
Launched to represent the views of the British people.
To go where other broadcasters refuse to go.
How did you find out about the story in the first place?
Launched with one aim.
To be the fearless champion of Britain.
It's an absolutely fantastic atmosphere here.
This is GB News.
The People's Channel. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Michael Portillo joins me now. Michael, what's on your show at 11?
Good morning, Camilla. Well, I hope a series of quite interesting questions. For instance, what's going to happen next in the politics of Scotland? Or what exactly is going on the campuses of the United States with all these protests and these student encampments? We're going to be asking how fragile is the economy of Iran, and would it be able to withstand an all-out war with Israel? Turning to the British economy, has it become as flabby and as bloated as the economy of France? And our last item today is going to be talking about what you do with leftover food, because a terrible quantity of food gets wasted, and there's something that we can all do about that.
All right, thank you very much indeed for that, Michael. Just for the record, my food, if it passes the sniff test, it's fine. I don't really go with best befores, particularly on yoghurt, because I think we're just throwing away food unnecessarily. But I digress. Now, in a minute, I'm going to be speaking to former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick about whether the Rwanda plan can really take off. So don't go anywhere, because you'll really want to hear what he's got to say. He's got a new report out on legal migration as well. But first, a quick weather update.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, here's your latest weather update for the Met Office for GB News. We'll see an east-west split weather-wise across the UK today. Rain at times towards the east, generally a bit brighter the further west you go, but temperatures still struggling for the time of year. Confirmation then of a pretty wet picture across some central and many eastern parts of England. Towards the southeast, we could see skies brightening briefly, but this could set off some pretty heavy, potentially even thundery showers for a time. Whereas towards the west and northwest are generally bright today here, but again, notice a few showers dotted around as we go through the day. Temperatures really struggling under the rain towards the east, coupled with quite a strong northerly breeze, no better than 9 or 10 degrees in places here, whereas in the best of the sunshine further west was the highs of 12 or 13 Celsius. As we go through the evening into the overnight period, those outbreaks of rain will push away to the northeast, affecting the Northern Isles into the early hours of Monday. Elsewhere, it will turn clearer for a time, but notice further showers gathering out towards the west, some of those starting to merge to longer spells of rain towards the morning. And other clear spells out towards the east, it will turn quite chilly. Could see a local frost by Monday morning in 1 or 2 spots, but generally those temperatures picking back up as these showers come back in across the west there. As for Monday, well, again, an east-west split developing in the weather, but this time a reversal of fortunes, with the east and southeast seeing the best of the dry and bright weather. Whereas out towards the west, there'll be plenty of showers around. Those showers, again, merging at times to some longer spells of rain. And although pretty wet out towards the west, temperatures generally starting to pick up, with highs of 12 or 13 Celsius towards the north, up to 15 or 16 degrees in the southeast.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Welcome back. Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary and Labour MP for Ilford North, joined me earlier. Let's just quickly hear a bit of what he had to say.
There will be millions of people, disaffected Conservative voters like Dan Poulter out there, who can see the chaos in the Conservative Party, see the failure to deliver, and are looking at the alternative. And I'd ask those people to trust the doctor, who's seen the Conservative Party up close, has seen the changed Labour Party of Keir Starmer up close, and has decided that ultimately we need a Labour government in this country to get our NHS back on its feet, to turn the economy around, and to make sure that we can look to the future with hope and optimism again.
All right, well, let's get a reaction to that and indeed the issue of migration with former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, the Conservative MP for Newark, who joins me in the studio this morning. Lovely to see you again, Robert.
Good morning.
This Dan Poulter defection, let's just deal with it quickly. I mean, Wes Streeting's rubbing his hands together with glee. This is brilliant. A doctor saying that the Tories have neglected the NHS, so he has to switch to Labour.
Well, I found it a very confusing resignation because I think Dan is wrong on the issue. You know, since 2010, when he was elected, we have increased funding for the NHS by almost 40% in real terms. So tens of billions of pounds extra. There's no suggestion that the Conservative Party doesn't care about the NHS, public services.
You must admit it's been a more difficult situation post-COVID to get a doctor's appointment. You've got now nearly 9 million on waiting lists, and we've had stories of people having to extract their own teeth with pliers because they can't get in to see an NHS dentist. So you cannot understand the Poulter side of the argument, surely.
Well, I can understand some of the concerns of members of the public. I know them myself, my constituents feel them, and a lot of that does go back to the pandemic, which was an unprecedented event that put immense pressure on the NHS and its workforce. I think we are starting to turn the corner there. NHS waiting lists have been falling now, I think, for the last 5 months. But the idea that the Labour Party is the answer to this problem is complete nonsense. All you have to do is look at Wales, where they do run things.
We've been looking at Wales all
They've reduced
morning.
funding for the NHS and performance is worse across the board.
Wes Streeting says that overall responsibility for NHS failings needs to land with Westminster. But
well, he would say that, wouldn't he?
He would say that, but let's park that now. Let's talk about migration, because you've come out with a report with the CPS, these... had a mind blank. The
Centre for Policy Studies.
I was going to say Centre for Political Studies. I was thinking, what? The CPS. And basically, you're calling, which will be probably music to people watching and listening to this ears, you're calling for a cap on legal migration. You're saying that legal migration numbers should be capped at 100,000. How would that actually work in practice? Because David Cameron, of course, talked about tens of thousands, and then everyone started putting their hands in the air going, oh, no, you know, the NHS will collapse if we put a cap on figures and all the rest of it. Can it work?
Yes, I believe it can, and it would do, and it has to work, because for the last 30 years, politicians of all stripes have promised controlled and reduced immigration, only to deliver the opposite. And the public are rightly furious at what's happened. It's placed immense strain on housing, on public services, on community cohesion, and it hasn't improved the economy. If it had, we would be racing ahead when, in fact, we've got low productivity growth and an economy which has been in recession for almost the last 2 years from a GDP per capita perspective. What we're proposing is that we return to the tens of thousands, but unlike previously, we have a cap. So Parliament itself votes for a democratic lock, so the public can have a degree of confidence, which they don't have today, that when politicians say these things, they mean it, and this will actually happen. And what I want to see happen is a budget, like the budget we have with the Chancellor. I want to see a budget by the Home Secretary, where they have to go to Parliament with proper forecasts, because remember, all these forecasts from the ONS, the OBR, have been terrible at predicting the future of immigration
Yeah, well, the
and have
OBR
real
thinks that
trade-offs explained.
300,000 legal migrants is baked into the system.
But that's far too high, Camilla.
Well, of course it's too high, but at the same time, we've had successive governments, Tories included, failing to do anything. I mean, this rise started with Blair. You give an extraordinary number here. Then 25 years up to Blair being in power, there was 68,000 net migration. The 25 years subsequently, we had 5.89, so that's 100 times as many legal migrants coming into the country.
And these are extreme levels.
Yes.
And I think, as you're saying, a lot of politicians and the media in Westminster are desensitised to what's happening. I don't think the public are.
No.
I think the public are extremely concerned and they want politicians to finally do something about it.
What do you mean about Britain being a grammar school? You're talking about quality over quantity when it comes to the type of migrants we take in.
That's right. I want us to actually have a guiding philosophy behind our immigration system, not just make ad hoc, sporadic decisions about who comes here. And what I want to see is that we try to be highly selective. We choose people who will be net economic contributors to our country. The problem in recent years is that we've allowed very large numbers of people to come in, 1.2 million people last year, and we haven't thought carefully about who is going to really make a contribution to this country. And that is making the country poorer, not richer. There's been a prevailing orthodoxy that immigration is good for the economy. The report that I've done with the CPS and with Neil O'Brien, an excellent Member of Parliament, disproves that. It says that actually the type of immigration we're having, which is predominantly low-skilled, low-wage migrants, is costing you and I and taxpayers across this country money, and we need to be much more selective and choose people who really are the best and the brightest, or who specifically fill in shortages that we need as a country.
We're going to have to be really, really quick because we're running out of time, less time than I thought we would have. Very quickly, will these Rwanda flights take off in the summer, yes or no, do you think, Robert?
I think they will do, but that isn't the point. A few symbolic flights is not a deterrent. Why I've advocated so strongly for this policy is I want a proper deterrent. That's why I tried to amend the bill. The government chose not to do that. We've got to have a deterrent. I don't think this is it, unfortunately.
Sorry we've been squeezed, but you've got your points across and we can see the report on the CPS website, can't we?
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Robert Jenrick. I've got to go. I'm going to be back next Sunday at 9:30, but up next, Michael Portillo. Thank you for joining me today.
You really could be our next big winner with an incredible £20,000 in tax-free cash to play with this summer. What would you spend that on? Well, whilst you're thinking about it, listen to some of our previous winners getting that winning phone call from us.
You're the winner of the Great British Giveaway.
I'm slipping neck. Oh dear.
Oh my God, are you joking?
You're joking. Really? Seriously, it's not a wine. What is it?
Oh my God, this is amazing. Thank you.
The next winning call could be answered by you. For a chance to win £20,000 in tax-free cash, text WIN to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB05 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 31st of May. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline